Buenas noches a todos y todas. Muchas gracias por su asistencia a este nuevo encuentro virtual. Hoy hablaremos sobre COVID-19, The Start of History for Asian Corporate Law. Esta ponencia se dará en inglés y estará a cargo de Dan Pushniak. Dan Pushniak es un profesor asociado a la Universidad Nacional de Singapur. Es profesor en gobierno, perdón, en Comparative Corporate Law and Governance, es LLD and LLM from Kyushu University en Japón. Junto con Dan estará Edison Tabra, quien es profesor de la maestría en Derecho de la Empresa, y es PhD y MA por la Universidad de Navarra en España. Primero tendremos la presentación de Dan Pushniak y luego la de Edison. Ustedes pueden realizar sus consultas a través del chat. Lo pueden hacer en inglés o lo pueden hacer en español. Edison y yo lo transmitiremos a Dan Pushniak, o Edison también podrá responder las preguntas. Without further ado, please, Dan Pushniak, thank you for being with us today. And I give you the floor for your presentation.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor and pleasure, and I would like to start by thanking Edison and Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. As I said to Edison, about now, it is scary to think, but getting close to 20 years ago, I traveled through South America, and my starting point was in Peru. And to this day, it is one of my favorite memories that I have in the world, was traveling through Peru. So I was hoping, of course, to come and visit again, but unfortunately, because of COVID, I am just going to do this over Zoom. But I really hope that in the future, we can get more exchange between professors and students between Singapore and Peru. So what I'm talking about today is I'm talking about the start of the history for Asian corporate law. And what I mean by this is that there is a development that has been occurring within Asia that I think well known or that well understood. And the development is that corporate law traditionally has been transplanted from other parts of the world to Asia. And the main point that I want to make is that increasingly, although it appears that Asia is still transplanting law mainly from the US and from the UK, in fact, increasingly, Asia is making its own law, okay? And so the point that, if there's one point I want you to take away from this presentation, is that if you look at corporate law in Asia, you will see a lot of law on the books. You will see a lot of labels, legal terms that look very familiar, that look very Western, that look very much like they were transplanted from the US and the UK. But when you drill down, when you examine the details of what has been going on, they are actually very, very different. And they're very, very different because they're increasingly being localized. They're increasingly being changed in the way that they are being implemented to fit with the unique corporate situation in Asia. So that is the main point that I want to make in my presentation today. The starting point, I think, for understanding Asia and the interest in Asia is its economic importance. And there is a great book by a Nobel Prize winning economist, and the book is called The Next Convergence. And it was written by a Nobel Prize winning economist named Michael Spence. And what Michael Spence found, which is very extraordinary, is that if you look back, and he looked back over a long period of history, you find that most countries in the world until World War II grew at a very slow rate. Their economic growth was not nearly as fast as most people would think. And to give a very interesting example, which Michael Spence gives, industrial revolution in the United Kingdom. And the Industrial Revolution is known as the period where the West, the Western world, tended to overcome Asia. Historically, actually, the Asian economy was by far the largest in the world, if you go back thousands of years. But after the Industrial Revolution, the West became, especially Western Europe and the United States, the economies became much more powerful than Asia and the rest of the world. But what is amazing is that the growth rate in the Industrial Revolution in the UK was merely 3 or 4%. In Japan, after World War II, the economy grew for decades at a rate of 9 or 10%, consistently. And as a result, Japan after World War II, which was, of course, destroyed and in terrible condition, from 1952 until the 1980s, the Japanese economy doubled many times in under 10 years. The size of the economy doubled many times in under 10 years. And the result of that was Japan went from a poor developing country after the war to, by the late 1980s, on some measures, it had the richest economy in the world and the largest stock market in the world in the late 1980s. This Japanese example was repeated in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and it is now being repeated in China. Now, of course, in China, the effect is even larger because China has over 1 billion people, right? 1.3, 1.4 billion people. And the overall result of this is that Asia has become the economic engine of the world, right? And if you look at the statistics, it is quite amazing. If you go back 30 years and you look at initial public offerings, so the amount of money raised on stock exchanges, New York and London were far ahead of any other stock exchange in the world. And in the last 10 years, Shanghai and especially Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, has in many years, a majority of the years, been the #1 stock market in terms of raising new capital through IPOs, right? Ahead of London and New York. So you have this huge change. I also did an empirical study looking at Fortune 500 firms recently. The Fortune 500 being the 500 largest companies in the world. If you go back to the 1980s, Western Europe and North America had double, triple the amount of Fortune 500 companies as Asia. In the 1990s, because of Japanese companies, Asia went up, but didn't come close to catching North America or Western Europe. Today, as I give this speech, Asia has many more Fortune 500 companies than the United States or North America, United States and Canada or Europe. And in fact, China accounts for a large portion of those, but you also see them in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. Another quick, fascinating statistic is about Singapore. So many people see the growth in Asia over the last several decades as just Asia catching up to Western Europe and North America. But Singapore is an interesting example of a country that has not only caught up, but also passed North America and Western Europe. The GDP per person in Singapore in the 1960s, when Singapore became independent, was equivalent to a developing sub-Saharan African country. Today, the GDP per person on a purchasing power basis, according to the IMF and the World Bank statistics, is double Japan, is much higher than the United States, much higher than Switzerland, standing at getting close to $100,000 on a purchasing power basis per person per year. And so this extraordinary story is something that I hope is of interest to Peru. I hope it is of interest to South America, because what it shows is that in the span of 20 or 30 years, country or many countries in a region can leapfrog, can go from being a developing country to one of the richest, or even in Singapore's case, arguably the richest country in the world. And this can be done in 20 or 30 years. Now, of course, what people always want to know is, how did this happen? Right? And they want to know this because they want to repeat it, or they want to maintain it, right? And the question of how this happened, of course, as a corporate law professor, I like to think that some of this, or a lot of this, has to do with corporate law and governance. Clearly, that is not the only thing that's important, right? My wife is an elementary school teacher, right? And she will tell you that education of young children is a very important reason why Asia and Singapore have become so prosperous and wealthy. And I'm sure education has a lot to do with it. I'm sure healthcare has a lot to do with it. I am sure politics has a lot to do with it. I am sure anti-corruption measures have a lot to do with it. But I do think that corporate law also has a lot to do with it. And so what I'm going to look at today is the corporate law part of this fascinating story in Asia of enormous economic prosperity. And I would like to mention, before I move on, that India and Indonesia, right? These are two massive countries. India will have a population greater than China, right? 1.4 billion people. Indonesia is often forgotten, right? Indonesia has 250 million people. The Philippines has over 100 million people. Bangladesh and Pakistan, 200 million people each, right? These are huge countries. And they're also growing at very quick rates these days. Often they're forgotten because of the China story, which is interesting. But the interesting point I want to make about corporate law is, if you go back to the 2000s, the start of the new millennium, there were two famous Harvard and Yale law professors, Professor Hansman and Crackman. And they published a very influential article in 2000. The article was called "The End of History for Corporate Law." And what they predicted was that all of the world would come to resemble the United States or the United Kingdom in having companies where the largest companies were focused on protecting shareholder rights, but more importantly, where the largest companies had widely dispersed shares. And what I mean by widely dispersed shares is, if you look at the top 100,000 shareholders, none of them owns a big block of shares. In the perfect widely dispersed company, you have no big shareholders. You have all small shareholders. And there was a lot of writing in the late 2000s, in the early 2000s and late 1990s in the United States that said that this is the end of evolution. The United States and the United Kingdom have figured out the best corporate form, and that this is going to be adopted all over the world. The important point I want you to remember about this Asian corporate law story is that this has not happened in Asia at all. When you look at Japan, when you look at South Korea, when you look at Hong Kong, when you look at Singapore, when you look at China, we do not have widely dispersed companies on the stock exchanges. What we have on the stock exchanges are two types of companies. Family-owned companies, okay, companies where a family starts the business and then they list it on the stock exchange, but when they list it on the stock exchange, they keep a majority of the shares. They keep control. The other very important type of company is state-owned companies, okay, where the government is the largest shareholder. Now, again, if you go back to the 2000s, you had many prominent business school professors, law school professors in the United States, mainly, also some in the United Kingdom, and they said that state-owned companies are just a step towards the evolution to development. In other words, owned companies are going to disappear in all countries that become rich. Singapore. Family-controlled firms are just a step. They're like, if you put it in evolutionary terms, they're like the missing link. Yeah. We have a fully evolved human, we have apes, and we have something in between, right? And this is like we are evolving, and they're going to get rid of state-owned enterprises and family-owned firms. But what I can tell you, and to take Singapore as an example, almost every listed company in Singapore is either a family-controlled firm or a state-owned enterprise. And Singapore has now become much richer on a per-person basis than the UK and even the United States, right? And so this, to me, is an extremely interesting phenomena, right? That you have this prediction, right? And the prediction, I'm just trying to, just one second, I'm going to try to change my slide here, which I think for some reason is frozen. Just hold on one second. There we go. So the prediction, right, that was made that you are going to get US and UK style dispersed shareholding companies has not come true in Asia, and it was not responsible for this amazing growth in Asia. So that is a significant point I want you to remember. In fact, I'm doing a whole historical on this one point. Right? However, even though these widely dispersed companies have not developed in Asia, and they are not the reason for the growth story in Asia, legally, Western law, Western corporate law, and corporate governance principles and mechanisms have been transplanted to Asia. Okay, so even though the corporate form that was predicted to be transplanted didn't go to Asia, when you look at the law and you look at the corporate governance principles, and you read what I call the law on the books, right? You will see many features that look very much Anglo-American, okay? And what do I mean by this, right? What I mean by this is if you look at the most prominent features of quote-unquote Anglo-American corporate governance, you will find things like independent directors. Independent directors are clearly something that was started in the 1970s States, and you see them all throughout Asia. Derivative actions and other types of shareholder rect minority shareholders. These are also creations of the UK and the US, and you see them throughout all of Asia. If you look at the regulation of hostile takeovers, which has been seen as very important for good corporate governance, again, these regulations, like what you see in the UK or the US, right? If you look at corporate governance codes, and most recently stewardship codes, they look very much like the US and the UK. Now, there is a reason for this. There are two reasons. You can see on your screen right now, right, the British, this is a map of the British Empire. So one reason is that, take Singapore as an example, and you could also use India, Malaysia, Hong Kong, right? These British colonies. And so there is a long history originally of the UK law being imposed on these jurisdictions. And later, these jurisdictions voluntarily adopting this law. Reason, which is US economic power, right? Very clearly, out the 2000s, but even since World War II, right? The US has been a dominant, perhaps economic superpower. And because of that, many countries in East Asia, Japan, that was occupied by the United States, Korea, Taiwan, I think people even would be shocked to find out that mainland China, the People's Republic of China, has imported a lot of American corporate law, right? Taiwan. And the reason for this is quite simple, that the United States, now things have changed dramatically in the last year or two, right? But in the past, the United States used to be the biggest funder of international organizations, right? Like the IMF, the World Bank, right? In the WHO, but no more. Yeah. But in the past, right, the US was the funder of these organizations, and these organizations promoted US law, right? So in the Asian financial crisis, a lot of companies needed loans from the IMF, and as a conditionality, they had to take the legal reforms if they were going to get the money. Yeah. And of course, the ones who were writing the legal reforms were American lawyers, right? Because the US funded most of the IMF. And so what you see in Asia is this development on the books of all of these Western principles, some for colonial historical reasons, some because of the economic power of the United States. So on one level, these concepts make sense. On another level, these concepts are bizarre. They don't fit with the local situation. Okay, they don't fit with the local situation is because they are for companies that have no big. These mechanisms are not designed for family-controlled firms, for state-owned enterprises, and that makes sense. Why does that make sense? That makes sense because they were created in the US and the UK, and the US and the UK are not dominated by these type of companies. Now, increasingly, you will read literature from great scholars and good friends of mine, like Jeffrey Gordon at Columbia University, or Ronald Gilson at Columbia and Stanford University. And they describe a phenomena that has occurred in the US where shares have become more concentrated. But when they talk about that phenomena in the US, they are talking about institutional investors, mutual funds, pension funds, owning US companies. This is much different than a state-owned enterprise. And the reason is that institutional investors, they tend to own small blocks, 5% or less, right? They do not own 51% of a company, right? And why is that important? Now, I keep this talk short because I want time for Edison to be able to speak, and also for you to be able to ask questions. But why it matters, the difference between a 51% shareholder, which is the norm in a state-owned enterprise or a family-owned company, and just a 3%, a bunch of 3% institutional investors, is because the type of mechanism that you need to solve the corporate governance is different. And I'll just use one example, which is the independent director. Okay, and I have a book on this, which looks at the independent director in Asia, and what you see is that independent directors were created in the US in the 1970s to solve the problem that when you have no big shareholder, when everybody shareholder in General Motors is like me, and they own 0.001% of the shares, then no one will have the economic incentive, motivation, or strength to be able to challenge the CEO and the senior management in the company. So when you have no big shareholder, but all small shareholders like me, the problem is that you need to have somebody who is independent from the CEO and the senior management to watch them. However, in a company like Singapore Airlines, the government owns over 50% of the shares. They have invested billions of dollars. They can call a shareholders meeting in 1 second because they own 51% of the shares. They have the incentive to monitor, and they can throw out the senior executive if he or she is not doing a good job very quickly. You can see how the independent director makes perfect sense in the United States, but you would ask, why did Singapore implement independent directors? And there's a very long story about this, but it's not just Singapore. Japan has, China has, Taiwan has, Hong Kong has, almost every jurisdiction in Asia has. Now, there are multiple reasons why they adopted it. Some is the IMF imposed it in Korea. Some is that in Singapore, they followed the UK Corporate Governance Code. But interestingly, although it looks like all these jurisdictions have followed the US and UK, when you look at the details of how they have implemented, how they have enforced the independent directors, you notice something very interesting. Every jurisdiction in Asia has redefined what it means to be an independent director. And they've redefined it by saying that you have to be independent, not just from the CEO and the senior management, but also from other big shareholders. Why? Because the job of the independent director is changed to not watch the CEO and senior management, which is done very easily by a big shareholder, but instead to watch the big shareholder. Okay, so this is an example of how, if you just look at the surface, you may say, oh, Asia has copied the United States, and the UK. But when you look at the details, you realize they have only taken the name, but increasingly they have changed the mechanism to suit this very important difference in the way their corporate governance functions, because of the fact that they have family and state-owned firms with big shareholders. Another quick example, which I'm looking at these days, is stewardship. Now, stewardship is an idea created in the United Kingdom, and why it was created in the United Kingdom was because after the financial crisis in 2008, there was a review done of the UK corporate governance called the and Walker was a very prominent academic in the asked by the British government, the UK government, to do a review of their corporate governance. And what Walker noticed is that most of the companies listed on the stock exchange, London Stock Exchange, now have institutional shareholders. So pension funds, mutual funds, index funds own most of the shares in most big UK London Stock Exchange listed companies. And he blamed the financial crisis on the fact that these institutional investors are not monitoring. They're not doing their job to watch the board of directors. So the UK created a stewardship code. The stewardship code is intended to motivate, incentivize institutional investors as shareholders to actively monitor the senior management of companies. Now, the interesting thing is stewardship codes have now been adopted in Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, Malaysia, all over Asia. But the problem is that most of these Asian countries, in fact, all of Asian countries, I just calculated the statistics yesterday. On average, institutional investors own 11% of shares in Asian countries. In the UK, they own 68%. In the United States, they own 80% of the shares. So when it was adopted into Asia, again, it is a misfit. It doesn't make sense because 11% of the shareholders solve systematic corporate governance problems. So again, the question is, why have a story? But the interesting thing is, if you look at Singapore, when they adopted something called the Stewardship Code for Family Businesses. This code has nothing to do with institutional investors. It's entirely different from the UK idea, but people looking at it from afar without examining the details will say, oh, this is a stewardship code. They have copied the UK. When in fact, if you look at the details, it is something entirely different. My feeling is, and I will end in just 1 or 2 minutes, that COVID-19, what we are seeing is we are seeing a disruption or a breakdown of the global community, right? I think nobody, of course, knows what is going to happen with COVID-19, but even today, if you read the news, you can see the global community is breaking down. Even the Western Anglo-American powers are separating, right? Europe just opened its borders this morning, but they excluded the United States, right? The United States is not allowed to travel because of how bad the COVID situation is in the United States. I think increasingly what you are going to see is, instead of globalization, you are going to see regionalization, right? We are already seeing this with these travel bubbles, right? Especially within Asia, you are seeing increasing focus on the region. You are seeing increasingly trade links are stopping between China and the US, and they are building in China and the rest of Asia. They are building between China, India, and China and ASEAN. And if this continues, right, I think also what you are seeing is an increasing development of Asian solutions like the Stewardship Code, like the way the independent director was changed, Asian solutions for Asian problems. And so this is what I mean by the start of corporate law in Asia. Increasingly, will Asia be creating its own mechanisms, feeling that it doesn't even need to use the names of Western mechanisms? And this is a question that I have. I don't have an answer at this point, but a question that I have. And I think this could be a very positive development because Asia has a lot more in common with the rest of the world, with the US and the UK, from a developmental standpoint, the quick development, but also from the way that corporations are structured. The US and the UK, ironically, are outliers, right? They are different in having widely dispersed shareholding compared to the rest of the world. And therefore, I think Asia could be an example for the rest of the world. So with that, I apologize for going a bit over time, but I just want to thank again Edison and Pontifical Catholic University of Peru for giving me this opportunity to share some ideas about Asia, and I hope they also have some relevance outside of Asia. And most importantly these days, I just want to wish you all to be safe and healthy. I understand that Peru is slightly loosening, some of which happened just a week ago in Singapore. And I'm sure that tomorrow many of you will be more happy that you can have a bit more freedom. And with that, I hand over the mic to Edison to have some comments. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, good evening with all. Thanks to Dan for giving us this incredible short lecture. So me and the rest of audience are read and enjoyed a lot about your speech. So I'm going to share some thoughts about your ideas and maybe do some complements with the experience from Peru. And I will add some extra information with other countries like Chile, Colombia, and Mexico. Let me share my slides. Well, just for putting in perspective, we have to see that in the case of Peru, as in the rest of South American countries, corporate law mixed both kind of regulation, self-regulation expressing corporate governance codes, or maybe behavior codes or social responsibility codes, and state regulation given in the Companies Act. In the case of Peru, we have a Companies Act from 1998. So I can share that in Peru, companies represent just 0.2 of the number of companies in the country. The rest are practically micro enterprises who works around that territory. And we have another word. Probably this is the kind of Peruvian history corporate law, because we live with an informal business. It's very normal, actually. For example, for pandemia, there are a lot of business as represented in people, or maybe in group of people selling their products. So they belong to informal world of business. So in this case, for example, Peruvian corporate law have a homework to do with them in order to include them in the formal circuit of the market. And something like that, it happens in other countries, but in the case of our country, probably we are probably the king of the informal business. Let me share some problems in our region. In Peru and the rest of countries, we can see, according to Aguilera data, that there are two big problems according to or related to corporate law. The first one is the protecting minority investors. Is that because our legislation, especially Companies Act or maybe corporate governance code, have to give more emphasis in order to give more rules to protect minority investors, because maybe the perception is to be more flexible with majorities. This is a little controversial because our legislation probably is focused to protect the minority, but maybe in the practice, for example, in case of board of directors or maybe the CEO, they tend to protect, or maybe they follow rules given by majority controllers. And another problem in our countries is, for example, corruption perception. As you can see, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, corruption perception is very high. And this is a big problem for us because we have had antecedent from the case of Odebrecht, but this is just one case. Probably the region have more cases related to corruption, and this is a point that the corporate law, especially corporate governance, have to give some solution. This is because that in most of these companies related to corruption, they have corporate governance code, they followed corporate law rules, and they have compliance rules, but they committed corruption, or maybe they involved with other companies and the state corruption acts. So in this case, my perspective is that in Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, we have to create a more effective corporate law and corporate governance in order to give some real or maybe realistic solution in order to prevent some danger things which could make suffer the sustainability of the companies. In this case, for example, corruption. Let me share some piece of the and Kim. In fact, Danks have some connection between Asia. One of the main problems in the case of corporate governance, especially in Peru, is maybe to tackle operation of minority shareholders, because we have many rules that protect them. They maybe distortionate the situation. So maybe one problem in this point is maybe that if the company needs to evolve or maybe to change their purpose, in some cases the minority shareholders probably they don't want to do that, or maybe they don't want to accept that. And another thing is maybe that in South America, like in Asia, independent directors have more ideas, or maybe probably it has been as a solution, but we have a problem in this case. And which is the problem? Which is the problem in this case of independent directors in South America? Is maybe that they are elected by majority and in some cases by minority. And this is a problem because when the board of directors works or start functioning, they start being like two players or opponents, and probably they don't get any solution, or maybe they don't get an intra solution. So this is a problem, because Peruvian corporate law have had opened this option, but maybe in the practice we are not able, or probably we have difficult problems in order to put in practice this notion of independent director. And another thing, a link between Peru and Asia, and maybe I can include the other countries like Mexico, Chile, and Colombia, is that in Peru, we have a lot of familiar companies, probably medium, small, and big. We have a lot of family companies that it looks contrast in the case of UK and the United States. And this is a little controversial because in most cases, when we talk about corporate law issues and corporate governance issues, we try to follow more ideas from these kind of systems when the ownership structure is dispersed. So for me, it's a little complicated to understand that. I think that the most appropriate thing is to look another system of corporate law more familiar with us. And I think, for example, in this case, Asian experience, it would be a good idea in order to study or analyze, in order to do a good transplantation of the corporate law rules according our history, according our reality. I want to show another slide related to the law and corporate governance. For example, in the case of Chile, especially in the case of the application of the principle of transparency, for example. In South America, it's very problematic that our countries to be more flexible about transparency principle application. So in the case of Chile, they have a big homework, is that they have to open the transparency of their work in the case of the board of directors, of their operation, or maybe the CEO. They have is accompanied with the case of the work. Reference given by Maggi shows that worse and transparent. In the case of Colombia, the problem is probably because they have problems in relation to shareholder rights, the treatment to shareholders, especially in minority. They have problems in the put in practice of transparency, and they have a little problems in the case of the work of board of directors. So these problems probably needs to be solved in the case of Colombia in order that they could have a good corporate law, very efficient and very transparent or very productive. What about Mexico? In Mexico, for example, Maggi shows us that the main problem in the application of corporate law in his country is, for example, the rights of shareholders, especially treatment in themselves, that application or the practice of transparency, and the work of the board. Maybe in these moments we can see that South America corporate law have many things to solve, especially in the case of shareholders work, and maybe in the case in the board of directors, and in the practice of the transparency principle. And last, how about Peru? How about our country? Well, we have problems, especially in the treatment to shareholders, and the practice of the transparency principle, and the work or performance of a board of directors. So in this case, we have probably to sit down and maybe to think how to change the rules in order to resolve this kind of problems in the case of corporate law, or maybe in the corporate governance. Maybe Dan has referred about to create our history. So I think that could be the right point, because each country or maybe each region have to adapt foreign rules in order to solve their own problems. Another topic that they want to see is the case of the company groups in MILA countries. In this case, this region are formed by Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. In this case, maybe it happens like in Asia, in Singapore in this case, because we have a lot of company groups. So we have a string number of them. We focus from these countries. So in this case, for example, there are a lot of problems, or each country has their own problems, but in this case, maybe the most common problem among the four is to prevent conflict of interests. This is, for example, a homework that in the case of company groups in South America needs to be resolved. Institutional investors. Maybe Dan has referred about it, but in this case, we have in our region two kinds of institutional investors: mutual funds and pension funds. Especially in Chile and Peru, we have a big presence of pension funds, for example. In this case, maybe the work for the corporate law and corporate governance is maybe to incentivize the practice of the activism in the shareholders, maybe in the board of directors, in the case of independent directors, in the situation that they have to defend the stakeholders' interests. Another point would be that from voting in shareholder meetings, this is because in most of these shareholder meetings, investors or maybe shareholders don't want to participate. Another topic is the coordination of minority shareholders in order that they can organize perfectly and go to the assembly and participate very correctly and defend their interests themselves. And maybe another point that I think it's a little complicated in our region is overcome cultural resistance. This is complicated in our country because most of these institutional investors have a bad reputation in our region. And this is because they have been misleading, that they are a little or maybe they don't follow rules according to defend the interests of their shareholders, or maybe their clients, for example, pensioners or clients. So this is a point that actually institutional investors have their reputation so bad, or maybe in a transition to increase probably. So this is a point that needs to be solved, or maybe needs to be rechanged, because according to corporate governance theory, they promote good opportunity. They have a special rule because they can circulate capital that most local industries needs for their work. But a big point is probably to overcome cultural resistance in the region, especially in most of the poor people, or maybe in most of the in their clients, or maybe in the pensioners. Another topic I'm finishing is the case of independent directors. In the case of independent directors, we have a special difference with UK or US, Europe, is that in South America especially, we have board of directors and CEO staff separated. They work as independent institutions. So it is supposed that board of directors make supervision to the CEO, but what happened in the practice is that maybe they, independent directors have the perception that they are part of the administration. They have to contribute with the administration. They are part of the management of the business, but there is a problem. Maybe Lord 𝙎𝙬𝘽𝘽 made the focus when he thought about corporate governance is that corporate governance is related to the supervision of the business, of the management of the business. So in this case, in our region, independent directors have to work more, or maybe to give more emphasis in that supervision, or in their supervision function. That is maybe to control, or maybe ask for more information, or maybe demonstrate that they are defendant, or they defend the interests of the stakeholders, of their stakeholders. So this is maybe a homework that in our region needs to be solved, or maybe treated. Another topic is maybe stakeholder versus shareholder theory. 1 week ago, I saw an interesting between Colin Myers and Professor Bekchuk. It was and I think that both perceptions are probably interesting, but I think, and it's a personal opinion, but I think that in the case of corporate law in Peru, probably stakeholder theory would be, or probably would do more sense, because most of the business in our region must be perceived to create a reach for all people. But actually, most of the management just they just follow, or maybe for the interest of the shareholders. Especially, for example, in the case of mining sectors, the reputation of most of the mining companies are bad. But there are some companies who have worked, or maybe have shown that they work, or their work is just for the stakeholders too. And they have been permitted to continue working, and maybe this is for our countries, in this case of America, I think stakeholder theory would be more appropriate than shareholder theory. Another topic is the case of the composition of board. Maybe in this case, in Peru and the rest of countries, we were working about the composition. Maybe we have included some principle like a diversity. In this case, for example, it's very informed that we have to, or maybe the board of directors have to include women in the board of directors. But maybe I consider that there are the necessity to include more variables, more elements, or more criteria, in order to get enforced directors more efficient, in order to show that they defend to stakeholder interests. And finally, I'm sorry, I lost perception of time. And finally, I think that Dan referred about the UK system. So I consider that in this case, for example, I don't know how it's in case of Asia, but I consider that in the case of Peru and the rest of South American countries, a corporate governance code for private companies is necessary. And maybe this is because we have a 90% of our companies in Peru that they are not big companies, or they are not public companies. So in this case, I think that appropriate corporate governance code must focus for this kind of societies. And I see the weights corporate governance principles for large private companies that maybe could give us some ideas on how in Peru we can include or create this kind of self-regulation code in order to incentivize that the small and micro enterprises work and perform more effective and defend the interests of their stakeholders. I just put this kind of principles, but I think, and finally, that these ideas show that maybe in some cases, South America to Asia than another system.
So I just a very brief thank you so much. I learned more about Latin American corporate governance today than maybe I have ever learned. So I want to get a hold of your slides, but that was terrifically interesting. One main point that I think we agree with, which came out in your talk, is the idea of the similarities perhaps between Asia and Latin America. And one hopeful thing maybe about COVID-19, because it's hard to find anything hopeful. But one hopeful thing is that with the situation in the United States, I think there may be to look at different models, because I think the US was the sole economic superpower and playing a very large role in the IMF, World Bank, international organizations. Most people were just focused on the US and Anglo-American solutions and tried to force them into their systems. I think this will give a chance to maybe get out of this trend. I did receive a private question that, if you don't mind, I can try to answer quickly. The question I received in the chat was, how do you see the evolution of Chinese companies in terms of implementing anti-bribery programs for state-owned enterprises? We still see that there is this gap between transparency and business in several companies. So actually, with two colleagues of mine at the National University of Singapore, I have written a paper which talks about the Singapore model for state-owned enterprises and asks the question of whether this could be transplantable to China. And you raise a very valid and important question that is often raised about Chinese state-owned enterprises. I think China would be the first to admit that they have had to grapple with corruption, and corruption has been a major issue in China. And state-owned enterprises, I think, have been addressing this. Of course, no system is perfect, right? We see the Wirecard scandal in Germany. People generally think, and I think Germany is on the whole an excellent economy, has excellent regulators, and generally does not have a lot of corruption. But you see everywhere you can have corruption. The question is, and you will never completely get rid of it anywhere, right? You have Enron and WorldCom. Every country has scandals. The question is, how do you minimize it? In the Chinese case, the answer to the question is very different than in the United States and the United Kingdom. And the reason is that the government itself is the regulator, the shareholder appoints the judges, right? So you have this governance problem, which is that when you have state-owned enterprises, you have the shareholder being also the regulator, being also the appointer of judges. And the question is, how do you solve that problem? The World Bank and the IMF traditionally took the view, and even the Asian Development Bank, that how you solve the problem is to stop making the government a shareholder. But I recently did some consulting work and gave a speech at the Asian Development Bank. And the Asian Development Bank has given up this idea. Why? Because state-owned enterprises have been unbelievably successful, not just in China and Singapore and Hong Kong, but also if you see they play a role in Vietnam, they play a major role in India, they play a major role in many countries you wouldn't expect. And so rather than saying get rid of them, because saying get rid of them, that's not going to happen for decades, take them properly. And the answer, I think a good answer is to, Singapore again is not perfect, but there has not been a involving corruption internal to the company for a company. There was an instance recently of a major Singapore company involved involved in a bribery scandal, but they were trying to bribe Brazilian government. So that is, I think, a different type of problem, because so we're doing it too, but it wasn't stealing from the company, right? So there hasn't been since 1965 an instance of stealing from the company, and there are very few examples of corruption in owned companies. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time, because we're almost out of time, to go into how the Singapore system has created this with government-linked companies. Although you can look at, I have an article on the Singapore model and another one on independent directors, and I explain the system. But to explain it very short, the government has created regulations to separate its shareholding power from its governance power. And in fact, this may amaze you, but they have reduced their rights. They have limited their rights as a majority shareholder, because they know that there is a risk of this type of corruption. And China, unfortunately, in my mind, is not following. I think for China to fully succeed in getting rid of corruption, continue to be a big shareholder, they're going to have to limit the ability of the government to exercise its shareholder voting rights. In other words, the government is the economic holder of shares, but they have less power to influence the company. They're just the economic owner. In terms of control rights, they actually give themselves less rights than your average controlling shareholder. Why do you do that? Because as the question is correctly notes, there's a risk that if you have both government regulatory control and the corporate governance control, you will have problems with corruption, right? And so that is my answer to that question, which was an excellent question.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Edison. We have a couple of questions from Alberto Salazar. Alberto Salazar is associate professor from Carleton University. I will open his mic in order to, so he can make the question directly. Alberto.
Yes. Thank you.
Hello.
Alberto, escuchamos.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Abelardo. And thank you for the two presentations. I do appreciate the description of the Asian corporate governance system. It's very revealing. Thank you, Edison, as well, for highlighting really a rich agenda for corporate governance research in South America. I mean, the conversation, it's really amazing, because it really prompts us to think about a different model of governance for South America. I do have a couple, I guess, points. I wonder if that can be quickly addressed. I know time is limited. I understand and I know that Asia has a long history of developmental state. The state has played a strong role in development for decades. That's the parallel tradition. And we also know that the governance model in Asia has been categorized as state capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism that's predominant in Anglo-American countries, or different from a stakeholder capitalism that's more prevalent in Europe. So when I hear the description of the Asian experience, it really it comes close to the idea of state capitalism with a strong developmental state history. So my question is, how, I mean, the first question was about corruption. I'm glad you already addressed that. But the next question is what is the place and the role of the employees in this governance system? I understand that, for example, in Huawei, my little knowledge of Huawei in China, I hear that Huawei is controlled by a sort of an employee pension fund, some sort of employee pension fund where they have the largest control and not so much the government. So I wonder if you can walk us through how the governance works in a company like Huawei, how the government intervene, what is the place of the role of the employees, and how that might be different from the German model. Well, because in Germany, for example, in Europe, governments also have a stake in companies. They do have, they are shareholders, they are creditors, employees sit on the board and have control. So there are some similarity between the European style, especially the German style, with the Asian model. So I wonder if you can help us understand what are the main differences will work in a company like Huawei.
So an excellent question, and my only regret is that we have limited time, because I would like to, please send me an email. It would be great to be in closer contact with you.
Sure.
So just a few quick points, and you raised many interesting points. The first point was about the developmental state, right, and what role the state plays. And I think you hit the nail on the head, and you're very correct in saying that a lot of the story within Asian corporate governance has involved the state. And there are maybe 2 points that I would like to make in that respect. The first point is that I think increasingly there is an understanding, and even I would say an acceptance, that who the shareholder is will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I think even where 5 years ago, especially 10 or 15 years ago, people like organizations like the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, and the leading literature coming out of top universities around the world said that the proper owners are private shareholders, right? Especially private dispersed shareholders. And if you look at the OECD Corporate Governance Fact Book for 2019, if you just Google that, it will come up. And you look at, there is a section, I think it is actually page 17, if my memory serves me correctly, on shareholder concentration or dispersion. They actually admit to the fact that now it's becoming clear that the concentrated dispersed debate is not enough. It has become much more complicated, and that there are many different shareholding structures. Now, how this relates to your question is, I think that the idea of government owning shares is now become accepted, and I think that that is a good thing. It is a good thing because I don't think that whether the government owns a big block of shares, whether a family owns a big block of shares, whether index funds and pension funds own a big portion of the market, or whether the market is owned by individuals, each of those systems can work. each of those systems can also fail, right? And I think that the idea is to first identify what in your country or your region is the prominent system, and then to figure out how do I make that work. And of course, these things are not static. We like to think of them as taking a picture and frozen, but they evolve over time, right? If you go back 30 years ago in the US and the UK, 40 years ago, institutional investors were not the prominent shareholders. Now they are, right? So you have to say, at this point in time, we have this type of shareholder. How do we deal with it? Now with governments, I think this government model, and I actually am involved in a larger project in this, this government model, and this is the second point I want to make, is that there are different types of government models, right? So I think it's too simple to say that government models cover Asia. That is the truth, and that is a good observation. But then you have to look at how do those governments exercise their powers as shareholders. And that is very different as the example I gave in China and Singapore. Although China tries to say they're following the Singapore model, you'll see in a paper that I've done that I think they're quite different. Also, if you look at Japan's role, for instance, the Japanese government also played a very strong role. And I have a new research project. Now Japan, I think very few people know this. The Japanese pension fund is the largest in the world. They have been buying ETFs. They own 25% of the Tokyo Stock Exchange. There's no good paper on this right now. But the Japanese government formally also supported the keiretsu, the groups in Japan. And that was a different model as well, where they didn't actually own the shares, but they played a very strong role in promoting the corporate groups, in excluding foreign investment and allowing Japanese companies to grow. So I think that clearly you're right to say Asia has this strong government presence, but it has taken many different forms, right? Your second question about employees within the company is also a very interesting one. And I do think you're right to say that one way in which Europe, and when I say Europe, I mean continental Europe, stands out from the Anglo-American model is, of course, Germany is the most common example with co-determination. But if you look throughout continental Europe, there is some employee representation in many countries in Europe, right, on the boards. In Asia, you have a different makeup. So in China, you do have a requirement for employee representations, and they have a double board. It's different than the German board in structure, but if you, in my independent directors in Asia book, you can learn more about the Chinese board structure. And there is some employee representation, but that is not common throughout Asia. I think because of the UK and the US influence, China stands out in Asia as having that type of employee representation. Most countries in Asia formally do not have any board representation. So Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, India, they don't have employee representation. But if you look at Japan as an interesting example where institutionally lifetime employment has made it so that there's more employee feedback and influence on Japanese boards than in German boards, even though there's no formal corporate law requiring it. So what does this tell us? This tells us that you actually have to look at the law in practice. You cannot just look at the law on the books, because Japan is a great example of a lot of employee representation, whereas but they don't have any rule in their formal corporate law requiring it. In terms of your final point about Huawei, of course, a whole book, and I don't have time to get into it. Huawei, one thing that I think is often forgotten about Huawei and is lost in this debate with the United States is Huawei is about, according to many people who are experts in internet technology, is about a year to a year and a half ahead of any company in the world in 5G technology. You have to remember that. You have to stop for a second and remember that and forget about the politics. It's easy, or not so easy, but it's possible to copy and to catch up. But Huawei is not a story about copying. You can only copy to catch up. You can't copy to get a year and a half ahead of Nokia and Sony and Ericsson and all of the US and European companies in your technology. So Huawei has been innovative, incredibly innovative, and creative. And the fact that they've been able to get a year and a half ahead in the most important internet technology over the next decade is absolutely fascinating, right? And it's forgotten when there's all of this talk. And the question is, how did they do that? I'm going to be very honest. I don't know. It confuses me. Yeah, I have a lot of friends, and I am going to be looking at more details of this, but I have not done an in-depth forensic analysis to be able to responsibly tell you how Huawei has achieved this. I'm sure something probably has to do with government support. I'm sure something has to do with employees playing a role, but I can't responsibly give you an answer to that. But I think it's a terrific question, right? And you see that many Chinese companies. China, of course, has many problems. They are still a ways behind, but they are also leaders in many areas. And I think, it's like COVID. There's so much politics going on that people forget. I have many, many friends in different institutions in China, and they've almost completely wiped out COVID-19. Okay, now there's small outbreaks of a few hundred, but we're talking a country of 1.4 billion, right? And you're talking about outbreaks when they say there's a second wave. The second wave is 100 cases, right? And I think because of politics, unfortunately, right, people aren't looking at how have they achieved this. Now, maybe they've achieved this in ways that we don't want to copy. Maybe there's tactics other countries don't want to use, but it's important to investigate to at least understand what is going on, right? And all I can say about China, I have a major paper I'm working on institutional investors in China, and there's so many areas where people do not bother to dig into the details because they're just, oh, it's a Chinese Communist Party, it's not a Western democracy, so there's nothing to learn. That cannot be farther from the truth, right? The progress they have made is remarkable. I was first in China 30 years ago. I've been back 50 times. And what I can tell you is 30 years ago, I took a train from Beijing to Xi'an. It took me 2-3 days. Now they have high-speed rail, that the trains travel faster than Japan and many faster than Europe. And this is in 20 years they've went from this, right? There's something to be learned there. Again, I do not speak Mandarin. I speak Japanese and English. Unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish or Portuguese. But I have a good colleague who I'm doing this research with, who is from mainland China. And that's the only responsible way to do it, is to dig into the local situation, right? And to learn the local story. I apologize for not having a great answer to the last part of your question, but you raised it.
Okay. Thank you, Dan, for your amazing presentation. Muchas gracias, Edison, también por tu presentación y tus comentarios. Y muchas gracias a todos por estar con nosotros. Hasta la próxima, Dan Pushinac. I hope to see you soon and have you with us again in another presentation. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you then. Have a nice day. Bye.